The alien world beneath the burning orange sky felt alive, almost sentient. Ryder's boots crunched against the coarse, silicate soil, his breath ragged in the thin atmosphere. He wasn't supposed to be here, wasn't supposed to be running for his life, far from the battlefield, with only a handful of soldiers still left standing. Yet, here he was, alone. The last human standing on a planet so hostile, even the sun felt like it was trying to burn him alive. The mission had gone south before it even began. The enemy had tracked his position, their superior tech outpacing anything humanity had. But that wasn't what haunted Ryder as he sprinted through the brush, eyes constantly scanning the horizon. No, it wasn't the impending threat of death that clawed at him. It was her. Era. The one who had stared at him, cold and dispassionate, her words echoing in his mind, "Humans are ugly creatures." That look, the utter disdain, had burned him, but it also intrigued him. Era wasn't just another Zero soldier. She was different. There was a depth to her eyes that betrayed her stoic nature. A curiosity that defied her species' belief that humanity was nothing more than a pest to be exterminated. He'd seen her once before, at the border of the battlefield, a figure of ice and steel. Tall, commanding, her translucent blue skin glowing like moonlight in the chaos of war. Her long, silver hair cascaded like liquid starlight over her shoulders, her posture rigid, her aura intimidating. But it wasn't her beauty that unnerved him. It was the way she had watched him, almost like she was waiting for something. What, exactly, he couldn't say. And now, as he darted between the alien trees, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching him again. That somewhere, just beyond his sight, Era was tracking his every move. The world around him was eerily quiet. The usual hum of alien wildlife had quieted, as if holding its breath. His heartbeat thudded in his ears, his hands slick with sweat despite the cold. Don't stop. Keep moving. He was no longer a soldier of the Alliance, he was a fugitive, a man lost in an unfamiliar land. The surface of the Zero homeworld had been an impenetrable mystery for years, with its shifting biomes and dangerous wildlife. But now, it was a jungle he couldn't escape. And then he heard it. The faintest whisper of a movement, a crack of something large pressing through the foliage behind him. His pulse shot up. Was it her? No, it couldn't be. Era wouldn't waste her time on him, she had better things to do. He ducked behind a cluster of thick vines and forced himself to stillness. His breath caught in his throat as he listened. A shadow passed, one that didn't belong to him. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet betrayed him, rooted to the spot. There was no time to think, no time to wonder if it was a Zero patrol, or worse. But then, a soft voice cut through the stillness. "You're not very good at hiding." The words were calm, but they vibrated with the authority of someone who had grown up commanding armies, someone who knew exactly how to find what they were looking for. Era. He didn't dare move, didn't even dare breathe for a second, as her silhouette emerged from the shadows. Tall, regal, her blue skin shimmering faintly under the low light of the setting sun. Her eyes, those pale, alien eyes, locked onto his with an intensity that stopped him cold. "Don't move," she ordered, her voice soft, almost too soft for someone who could break him with a single command. Ryder's hand instinctively went to the sidearm strapped to his leg, but before he could draw it, she was upon him. She was fast, too fast. He barely saw her blur in motion as she knocked his hand away. Her grip on his wrist was like iron, unforgiving and precise. "You should be dead," she muttered, almost to herself, as her eyes raked over him. A moment of silence passed before she spoke again. "Why aren't you?" His heart thudded. He stared at her, the words on the tip of his tongue, but his breath wouldn't come. He had been trained to handle everything the galaxy could throw at him, but not this. not her. Era wasn't just a soldier. She was an enigma. You look at me, Ryder said hoarsely, trying to steady his voice, like I'm something beneath you. But you can't stop looking, can you? She didn't flinch, didn't even blink. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her eyes never leaving his. I'm not looking at you, Era replied coolly. I'm looking at your survival instincts. Something humans seem to hold on to, even when they have no reason to. Ryder's pulse raced. This was it. He had no plan. No escape. But something in her expression, a crack in her icy facade, made him hold on to his ground. What do you want from me? He asked, his voice coming out rougher than intended. Era's lips parted, and for a split second, there was hesitation in her gaze. But it was fleeting, like a shadow passing over water. Her composure returned, and she released his wrist, though her eyes never wavered. Answer me this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Why do you fight so hard to live, knowing that your kind is only delaying the inevitable? The Zero will win this war. Ryder's jaw tightened. His mind raced as he searched for the right words. But before he could speak, she stepped back, her gaze never leaving him. There was a strange tension in the air now, something thick and charged between them. Don't try to convince me of your humanity, Era continued, her tone shifting, no longer entirely cold, but something else, a hint of curiosity, of something she didn't fully understand. I've seen it. I've fought it. But there's something about you, something that doesn't fit. Ryder took a step forward, finding his voice again. Maybe that's the problem, he said, the corner of his lips lifting in a half-smile. I'm not like the rest of them. And you're not like them either. She didn't respond immediately. Her sharp gaze flicked over him, studying him like an object, a puzzle she didn't quite know how to solve. Then, for a moment, she softened. Her face, once the mask of an enemy, betrayed a flicker of something human, something real. And just like that, Ryder knew. This wasn't just a battlefield anymore. This was something else. Something that neither of them had prepared for. Era turned without another word, her figure dissolving into the shadows. But Ryder didn't move. He stayed where he was, the weight of her gaze still pressing against him even in her absence. Something had changed. He wasn't sure what, but he was certain of one thing, this, whatever this was far from over. Ryder had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and they screamed at him now, gnawing at the edge of his consciousness. He had spent the better part of the last few hours running, but his feet felt heavy with the realization that running no longer mattered. He could still feel her presence in the air, a ripple in the fabric of reality that didn't belong. Era. Even as he had sprinted through the alien jungle, dodging the thorns and the looming trees that seemed to close in on him, it hadn't been the hunt of the Zero soldiers that plagued him. No, it was her. Her voice, that glimmer of something beneath her cold exterior, had dug into his mind like an unwelcome seed, sprouting thoughts he hadn't prepared for. His breath caught when he stepped into a small clearing. The trees here parted slightly, the underbrush softer, more forgiving. It was a rare reprieve in this strange land, a brief moment of calm before the storm. He sank to the ground, his back against a jagged rock, the coldness of the stone seeping into his muscles, a stark contrast to the burning heat of his body. There was no escape now. He was trapped between the Zira and her. He could sense her waiting, watching, and it wasn't the thrill of being chased that unnerved him, it was the strange pull she had on him. She wasn't supposed to matter. She was the enemy. But Ryder wasn't sure what the enemy was anymore. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply. The night was falling, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for him like hands. The sounds of the jungle had returned, a low hum of unseen creatures, pulsing, alive, alien. But through it all, Ryder could only hear the echo of Era's words. "You're not very good at hiding." She had said it so calmly, as if speaking about the weather, but there had been something more. A curiosity in her tone. Maybe even a recognition, as if she'd seen something in him, a trace of humanity that didn't quite fit with the rest of his kind. His muscles tensed at the thought. No matter what she saw, no matter how real the pull between them felt, Era was a Zira soldier, and he was a human. There were no gray areas in a war. The rules were clear, and the stakes were high. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep telling himself that. The snap of a twig broke his reverie. Ryder's eyes shot open, his hand instinctively going to the weapon at his side. There was no sound after that, only the unsettling silence that followed the movement. His heart stuttered in his chest. Was she here? He wasn't sure why he wanted to know, or why his pulse quickened at the thought of her. He needed to focus. There was no time for distractions. No room for any of this. Yet, all the while, he could feel his attention slipping. Even when he forced his mind away from Era, his thoughts found their way back to her. Her voice. The coldness in her eyes that belied something far more dangerous. Another movement. This time, it wasn't a subtle noise. The rustle of leaves and the shift of air were unmistakable. Ryder stood in one fluid motion, back against the rock, hand clutching his weapon as his gaze darted toward the shadows. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. Then he saw it, a figure moving swiftly through the trees. A blur of silver, like the moon itself moving through the dark, cutting through the veil of shadows. Era. She emerged from the trees with the grace of a predator. Her eyes locked onto his with unyielding intensity. She didn't make a sound as she approached, but the force of her presence was undeniable. "I told you not to move," she said, her voice low, as if savoring the moment. There was no trace of the earlier coldness, no calculated cruelty. Instead, her tone was almost amused. Ryder stood taller, his body rigid even though his mind was fraying at the edges. "Why are you still here?" he demanded, his voice rougher than he intended. Era's eyes flicked over him, examining every inch of him, almost as if she were trying to figure him out, decode him in some way. Her lips parted, and for the briefest moment, Ryder could see something flicker in her expression, something soft, something almost human. But then, just as quickly, it vanished. "Why are you still alive?" she countered, her voice carrying a weight that suggested more than just a simple question. Ryder clenched his jaw. "I survive because I have to. And because I can." She tilted her head, her long, silver hair falling across her shoulder in a cascade of shimmering strands. The sight of her, so ethereal, so unattainable, made Ryder's pulse spike. He should have been focused. He should have been thinking of ways to escape. But her presence, her beauty, the calmness in her voice, drew him in. "You have no idea what you're up against," Era continued, her gaze intense, piercing through him. "You're running from something you cannot outrun. You are nothing in the face of my people." "I've been running from things all my life," Ryder shot back, his eyes narrowing. "But I'm still here, aren't I?" For a moment, there was silence between them. The air between them thickened, charged with an energy neither could deny. The crackle of tension was palpable. And then, unexpectedly, Era took a step forward. Not an attack, not a challenge, but something softer. Something unspoken. Her eyes softened, just slightly. It wasn't enough to disarm him, but it was enough to make his heart falter. "I don't understand you," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Humans, You're so different. You fight against impossible odds, even when you know there's no chance of winning. Ryder met her gaze, his heart racing, even as his mind urged him to step away, to run. To put distance between them. Maybe that's what makes us dangerous, he replied. Maybe that's what makes us worth knowing. Era's eyes flicked down, as if searching for something on the ground. When they returned to his, they held a new depth. Something almost human. Something almost vulnerable. Why do you fight? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryder hesitated. The question wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't about the war, or the enemy, or even the fate of his people. It was about him. I fight because I believe there's more than just survival, he said, his voice steady despite the thunderstorm of emotions roiling inside him. I fight because I believe there's something worth fighting for. Something beyond this war. Era didn't reply right away, but her gaze lingered on him, more thoughtful now than before. And Ryder realized something. The woman standing in front of him wasn't just his enemy. She was a riddle. A mystery that, no matter how hard he tried to understand, was never going to be simple. The storm was coming. And this time, it wasn't just the Zira he had to worry about. It was her. The night felt heavier than it should have, thick with the scent of damp earth and the buzzing of unseen creatures. Ryder's senses were on edge, but it wasn't the jungle's typical hum that had his skin crawling, it was the quiet that surrounded him. Silence, punctuated only by the crackle of distant thunder and the occasional rustle in the underbrush, made his every step feel like an intrusion. Era hadn't followed him. Or at least, that's what he thought. She disappeared after their conversation, like smoke dissipating into the air. But Ryder knew better than to believe in coincidences. She was out there, watching. Waiting. He could feel her presence as surely as he could feel the earth beneath his feet. As he moved through the dense foliage, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his blade, he replayed their exchange. Her words, those soft, near-inaudible whispers, echoed in his mind. You fight because you believe there's something worth fighting for. What did she mean by that? Was she challenging him? Or was there something deeper? He couldn't tell anymore. Every interaction with her seemed to pull him deeper into a web of confusion and longing. But there was no time for distractions, not with the Zira soldiers closing in. He ducked under a low-hanging branch and continued on his path, the thudding of his heartbeat a constant rhythm in his ears. The sounds of pursuit weren't far behind. He had to stay ahead of them. But even as he pushed forward, something in his gut told him to look over his shoulder, that the real threat wasn't just the Zira anymore. The rustle came again. This time, much closer. He froze. Every muscle in his body screamed for action, but his eyes stayed locked on the shadows ahead. A shape emerged from the darkness, silent as a phantom. His heart skipped a beat as Era stepped into the clearing, her silver hair glowing in the dim moonlight, the contours of her face framed by the soft light. She was so still, so serene, it was as if she were part of the night itself. You don't learn, do you? Her voice was like ice, but there was something else beneath it, something that sent a shiver down his spine. It wasn't just the words. It was the way she said them, with a trace of, what? Amusement? Disappointment? Ryder's jaw clenched. I didn't ask for your help. I didn't offer it. Her eyes narrowed as she took a step closer, her movements fluid, almost predatory. You're not very good at this, are you? He stood tall, his gaze unwavering. Good at what? Running, she said, almost as though the word itself held a darker meaning. You're trying to outrun something that's always going to catch up with you. It's not the Zira you should be worried about, Ryder. It's me. Her words hit harder than any blow he'd received. For a moment, all he could do was stand there, caught between the fierce pull of her gaze and the growing sense of dread that twisted his gut. What was she saying? Was this a game to her? A test? You're wrong, he finally muttered, his voice strained. You're just trying to play with me. And I'm not buying it. She took another step forward, her boots barely making a sound on the soft earth. Are you so sure about that? The air between them shifted. It wasn't the weight of her words that paralyzed him, it was the undercurrent of something more. Something dangerous. Something that wasn't just about survival or enemy lines. Why are you here, Era? Ryder asked, his voice steady despite the rush of emotions crashing through him. What do you want from me? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took another step closer until the space between them was charged with an electric tension. Her eyes were locked on his, her lips parted slightly, as if she were about to say something important, something that would make it all clear. But the words never came. Instead, there was the distinct sound of a branch snapping in the distance. The sharp crack of it echoed through the clearing, followed by the unmistakable stomp of boots against the forest floor. Ryder's head snapped toward the sound. The Zero were closing in. Era's gaze flickered toward the sound as well, but she didn't move. She didn't even flinch. Ryder's heart pounded in his chest, his instincts screaming at him to act, to fight, to flee. But Era's presence, her quiet strength, held him in place. You don't have much time, Era said, her voice colder than before. You'll have to decide quickly. Run, or stay and face them. He swallowed hard. The Zero weren't like the rebels he'd fought back home. They were precision and power, trained soldiers with no mercy, no hesitation. But Era, she wasn't like them. She wasn't like him either. And that realization made him hesitate. Era turned her head slowly, her gaze sharpening. You think I came here to save you? You're mistaken. This isn't about saving anyone. He narrowed his eyes. Then what is it about? She didn't answer. Instead, she started to move, gliding through the trees like a shadow, her figure barely visible against the backdrop of the darkened jungle. She moved with such fluidity, such purpose, that Ryder couldn't help but follow. It was instinct. He had no choice. She was the key, the link to something that didn't make sense, something he needed to understand. He couldn't fight this alone. And he didn't know what it was about her that made him feel like he didn't want to. Stay close, Era's voice drifted back to him, low and commanding. He moved without thinking, his heart hammering in his chest as he followed her lead. The air was thick with the scent of danger now, the sound of the approaching soldiers growing louder. But they weren't just coming for him anymore, they were coming for them both. And that, in itself, was a problem. As they pushed through the underbrush, Ryder couldn't help but feel a flicker of uncertainty. This wasn't a fight he had been prepared for. And it wasn't just the Zira he had to worry about. It was Era. The undergrowth was thick, the air heavy with moisture as Ryder and Era slipped through the dense jungle. Every step seemed to sink deeper into the earth, a reminder that they were far from civilization, far from any safety net. But the danger wasn't in the jungle itself. It was in the way Era moved, like a shadow in a storm, always a step ahead, always just out of reach. Ryder couldn't shake the feeling that she was leading him somewhere. A place where the rules changed. A place where neither of them could escape the storm they were about to face. His feet moved mechanically, his mind still grappling with the weight of their previous encounter. Era had been distant, her words cryptic, but there was something else in her eyes, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Why are you doing this? Ryder asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them like a thick fog. His voice was strained, tension rippling through his muscles as he watched her glide ahead with effortless grace. Era didn't pause. She didn't look back. But her voice, low and cutting, came through the silence. You don't need answers right now. You need survival. Ryder clenched his fists, frustration boiling under his skin. I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for any of it. He took a step forward, his boots crunching against the dry leaves beneath him, the sound loud in the oppressive silence. But you're here, and that means something. So stop hiding and tell me what you want. She stopped abruptly, her back still turned to him, her figure outlined against the murky shadows of the trees. He almost didn't see the tension that rippled through her, how her shoulders stiffened as if she was wrestling with something inside. She finally spoke, her words softer, almost reluctant. I told you before. I'm not here to save you. Ryder's pulse quickened, the confusion gnawing at him. Then why help me? Why risk everything? What's your endgame? Era turned to face him, her gaze cold yet strangely intimate, like she could see everything beneath the surface. I don't need an endgame. I need you to understand something. Ryder's heart hammered in his chest. Understand what? Her lips curled into something between a smile and a sneer. That you're not the only one being hunted. You think it's just the Zero soldiers you're running from? You're wrong. Her eyes narrowed, darkened with something far older than fear, something far more dangerous. The words hit harder than any blow. The Zira had always been his focus, the threat they posed his obsession. But now, in the heat of the moment, he realized there was more at play than simple survival. You're talking in riddles. Ryder's voice came out low, almost a growl. You still haven't told me who or what you are. What the hell are you really doing here? Era took a step forward, closing the distance between them with a predatory ease. I'm not going to explain myself, Ryder. I don't owe you that. Her voice was quiet but firm, like the calm before a storm. But I will tell you this, your past is catching up with you, faster than you think. And if you don't start playing by new rules, you'll end up just another casualty. The tension crackled between them, thick and palpable. Ryder's breath quickened, each word from Era weighing heavily on his chest, forcing the air from his lungs. She was a puzzle he couldn't solve, a mystery that refused to be unraveled. But there was something else, something that kept drawing him to her. Maybe it was her confidence. Or the way she moved, with a grace that belied the danger in her eyes. Maybe it was the fire that burned beneath the coldness. Whatever it was, it made him want to trust her, even though his instincts told him not to. Before he could reply, the sounds of movement through the jungle reached his ears. Closer now. The Zira were almost upon them. We don't have time for this, Era said sharply, her voice clipped with urgency. We need to move. The sound of boots grew louder, the Zira soldiers closing in on them from every direction. Ryder's heart raced as he glanced at Era. Her face had turned to stone, her eyes calculating, already assessing the situation. You want answers? Era's voice was a whisper now, cutting through the thick air like a blade. Survive this, and you'll get them. But if we don't get out of here now, neither of us will make it. Ryder didn't hesitate. He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the nearest cluster of trees. They slipped between the dense foliage, silent as shadows, their footsteps barely audible against the soft, damp earth. The sounds of pursuit were only seconds behind, but their movements were precise, each step planned, as if they had done this dance 1,000 times before. Ryder's mind raced, his muscles taut with adrenaline. Every instinct told him to fight, to stand his ground. But there was something in Era's presence, something that calmed him, made him trust her judgment. "Where are we going?" he asked between breaths, his voice tight with tension. Era didn't answer immediately. She led him through a series of narrow paths, dodging branches and ducking under fallen logs. Her movements were fluid, practiced. She seemed to know this terrain like the back of her hand. "We're heading to the ruins," she said at last, her voice cold, distant once more. "It's the only place they won't find us." The mention of the ruins sent a chill down Ryder's spine. It was an old, abandoned structure, half swallowed by the jungle. Legends surrounded it, stories of the ancient people who had built it long before the Zira came to power. It wasn't a place most people went willingly. It was said to be cursed. But as Era led the way, Ryder couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this place than its haunted reputation. Something drew him to it, something hidden just beyond his understanding. They reached the edge of the clearing, the ruins just visible through the trees. But the Zira weren't far behind. Ryder could hear them, the thrum of boots on the ground, the crackle of comms buzzing through the air. They were closing in. There was no more room for retreat. Era stopped abruptly, her hand on Ryder's chest, pushing him back slightly. "Stay here," she whispered, her eyes meeting his with a new intensity. "This is where it gets complicated." Ryder opened his mouth to protest, but she was already moving, slipping into the shadows, disappearing from sight. And then, the hunt truly began.